Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of the fifth Katipunan Conference webinar series on regional conflict and security. The Zoom event is organized by the Strategic Studies Program of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies and the Philippine Office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in partnership with the UP Department of Political Science. We would also like to welcome our viewers from Facebook. The session is currently live streaming in the official Facebook page of UP CIDS. I am Captain Diane Despi from the Core Professors AFP, and I will be your host and moderator for today's session. So to formally start this webinar, let us welcome Professor Teresa Encarnacion Tadem, the Executive Director of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies, to give us the introductory remarks.
Unmute, share screen. Wait, I'm looking for the slide. Unmute now, okay. Distinguished panel speakers, guests, colleagues, and friends, good morning. On behalf of the University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies, or UPCIDS, I wish to welcome you all to the 5th Katipunan Conference with the theme, the Philippine Strategic Outlook 2021, Strategic Transformations and Responses in the Time of Corona. This virtual webinar international conference is co-sponsored by the Strategic Studies Program, University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines, and the Department of Political Science, College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, University of the Philippines, Diliman. This international conference is part of the 2020 activities of UPCIDS, which is the research policy unit of the University of the Philippines, or UP system. Founded in 1985 by then UP President Edgardo Angara, the UPCIDS is currently under the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs. Since its inception, the UPCIDS has sought to encompass various perspectives, methodologies, and ideologies in its conduct of basic and policy-oriented research. Under the strategic trajectory of the university since 2017, UPCIDS aims to contribute to national development and knowledge creation through enhancing research, publications, and creative work. Its channels to implement this vision include workshops, lecture forums, as well as webinars as we have this morning, as well as publications which include policy briefs, discussion papers, monographs, conference proceedings, and the Philippine Journal of Public Policy, Interdisciplinary Development Perspectives. These are all available in the UPCIDS website and in print. To attain our UPCIDS objectives, the Center presently has 12 programs which constitute the following cluster. We have the Education and Capacity Building Cluster, which consists of the Education Research Program, the Program on Higher Education Research and Policy Reform, the Assessment Curriculum Technology and Research Program, and the Program on Data Science for Public Policy. We also have the Development Cluster, which consists of the Program on Escaping the Middle Income Trap, Chains for Change, the Political Economy Program, the Program on Alternative Development, and the Program on Health Systems Development. And lastly, we have the Social, Political, and Cultural Studies Cluster, which consists of the Program on Social and Political Change, the Islamic Studies Program, the Decolonial Studies Program, and the Strategic Studies Program. UPCIDS also has its local regional studies network, which consists of the Cordillera Studies Center of the University of the Philippines, Baguio, and the Central Visayas Studies Center of the University of the Philippines, Cebu. Among the UPCIDS programs, it is the Strategic Studies Program with its convener, Professor Herman Kraft, which, as noted in our UPCIDS 2018 year-end report, aims to promote interest and discourse on significant changes in Philippine foreign policy and develop capacity building for strategic studies in the country. The program views the Philippines' latest engagements with the great powers and multilateral cooperation with other states in the Asia-Pacific region as a catalyst to further collaborative and multidisciplinary research between communities within East Asia. For 2018, as our year-end report further states, the UPCIDS Strategic Studies Program focused on activities which strengthened a core group of experts and researchers interested in strategic concerns with the university and on the consolidation of networks with institutions in the government and in the private sector that might be interested in developments that affect the policy options of the Philippines. These activities were further pursued in 2019. As our year-end report noted, the Strategic Studies Program organized events that engaged issues on the strategic situation of the Philippines, research that looked into the country's strategic situation, and outreach activities that seek to gain insight on how to institutionalize the networks of stakeholders on strategic studies in the Philippines. The anchor whereby the UPCIDS Strategic Studies Program seeks to attain these objectives is through the Katipunan Conference. As noted in our UPCIDS 2018 media report, the Katipunan Conference was launched in 2015, whereby the conference serves as a platform for discussing the current and emerging issues that impact Philippine foreign policy and undertakes an environmental scan from multiple perspectives in order to produce practical and informed policy options and decision-making aids for government agencies and officials. On February 27 and 28, 2018, the UPCIDS Strategic Studies Program and the UP Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea UP IMLOS of the UP College of Law organized the third Katipunan Conference with the theme The Philippine Strategic Outlook 2018 to 2019. This was followed the year later in August 2019, where the Strategic Studies Program held the fourth Katipunan Conference with the theme Philippine Strategic Outlook 2020, Strategic Transformations and Responses in the Asia and Pacific. And now for the fifth Katipunan Conference, the theme is the Philippine Strategic Outlook 2021, focusing on strategic transformations and responses in the time of Corona. This is certainly a most timely and relevant undertaking as there is a pressing need to address the crisis brought about by this pandemic. As noted in its webinar concept paper, a key question to address is, what does this new normal mean for the strategic environment of the Philippines? This is the second of the 4 webinar series of the UPCIDS Strategic Program is hosting. The first of which was on the strategic environment in a time of Corona, and the second one was on the pandemic and its impact on regional norms and international law in ASEAN. For its third webinar installment, the series will now look into conflict and security from 2 key experts on this topic. We have retired Rear Admiral Romel Judong, who is currently Professor of Praxis, School of Government at Ateneo de Manila University, as well as Executive Director of the Security Reform Initiative, and Jaime Naval, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, University of the Philippines, Diliman. I have no doubt that their presentations will generate an interesting and relevant dialogue during the open forum with regards to the current issues confronting and challenging strategic issues in the country in light of the pandemic. And more importantly, this will produce practical and informed policies to aid government officials, agencies, and other relevant major players. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tadim. So before we begin with our presentations, I would like to inform our Zoom attendees that they can use the Q&A button down below to send in their questions for the open forum later. Please make sure to indicate your name and identify the speaker to whom your question is addressed. Our Facebook viewers may also send their questions through the comment section, and we will try to address some of them during the open forum. So to start off, our first speaker for today is Rear Admiral Romel Jude Ong. He retired last year from the Philippine Navy as its Vice Commander and is currently Professor of Praxis at the Ateneo de Manila University School of Government. So let me now turn over the virtual mic to Admiral Ong.
Thank you, Professor Taden. Thank you, Diane. Good morning to all webinar participants. I was provided 3 questions for these webinars as part of the Katipunan Conference. We'll try to look at those 3 questions for this session. The first one is, how would you characterize the changes brought on by the pandemic to the strategic environment of the Asia-Pacific region? Now, let's go back to what Dr. Charmaine Willoughby stated during the last session, I think last week. He said, and when she said, the pandemic was actually a black swan event. It wasn't totally unpredictable event of global proportions. Now, the basic impact is on the global economy, and we cannot separate the global and the regional economy on this end. It impacts on the movement of people and goods, particularly industries that are relevant to trade and movement of people. And in fact, it has induced recession in some countries and stunted growth possibly for the next few years to come. Now, in a sense, the pandemic and the regional security environment are mutually exclusive events. Why? Because there were already pre-existing regional security issues before the pandemic hit, and it transcended during the current time where we have struggling with the pandemic. But the net effect among the Indo-Pacific or Asian nations is because they were forced to shut down and forced to isolate themselves, they become more vulnerable and more inward-looking, in a sense, to deal with the pandemic. The greatest loser of the pandemic in the region is China. To some extent, it has lost its credibility or international standing. And I will explain that in detail in a few minutes. And of course, it actually accentuated the mutually exclusive events. The pandemic accentuated the geopolitical tensions that are already existing. Now, what are those tensions? For one, China has sustained its posture in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. It seems that it was never affected by the pandemic. The movement of ships and aircraft continued even during the height of the pandemic. And this has everything to do with the struggle for sea control of those seas between them and the United States. During the pandemic, China was able to solidify its control over Hong Kong. Okay, I don't think we can revert back to the situation way before on the 2 systems, 1 country concept. It's not going to go back there. Another issue is the China and India are sliding towards a border conflict in Ladakh. Okay. And of course, yung Chinese expansion of economic influence in the Pacific Island states. And it's affecting the sphere of influence of Australia. Now, there are 2 schools of thought for this. One is China is trying to distract its domestic population because of yung impact ng pandemic on this population during the height of the pandemic, sometime of January and February. But there's also a possibility that China is actually using the crisis as an opportunity to pursue its more strategic moves, while most of the ASEAN countries are vulnerable. Now, during this period also, the trade war between US and China is already in full bloom. And US is looking at decoupling from the Chinese economy and containing specific industries. Example of which is yung Huawei and yung CCC, the construction company. Now, how is China affected by the pandemic in a negative way? One, there was the accusation of lack of transparency and responsibility over the reporting in dealing with the virus at the onset. US blamed China for the Wuhan virus and because it has suffered to some extent more than 200,000 deaths, aggravating their already tenuous relations. There were also negative effects of the mass diplomacy when yung defective PPEs were being distributed to other states in Europe. The influence operations that China was doing in the World Health Organization came into fore, particularly when the efforts to block Taiwan from participation in any international forum to address the pandemic. Okay. Now, moving on to the second question, what are the key sectors that were significantly affected and how were these changes altering the strategic environment? Okay. Now, in summary, the spectrum of responses to the pandemic affected the economy from one country to another. It depends on how each country in the region addressed the pandemic. For those who have flattened the curve, they were able to recover first. But for those still struggling with the pandemic, it's still a problem for them. As I said earlier, most countries look inward partly to address the effects of the pandemic from within and protect themselves from being affected from external sources. The net effect of this isolation is avoidance of multilateral engagements. Now, let's go back to the global economy, which was hardest hit. Now, it's expected that the global economy will lose at least 2.4% of the value of GDP. And global economic growth is forecast to be down from 3% to 2.4%. The most affected is the global supply chain. And the hubs of this supply chain are China, US, Europe, and Japan, because of the restrictions on air and sea transportation and movement of people. Now, at the heart of the global supply chain is the global value chain, of which China is the center of it. The impact of China, due to the shutdown of its production facilities, has led to a 13.5% drop in industrial production in January and February, affecting both imports and exports of goods. Now, why are we focusing on the economy and on China on this? Because eventually, it cascaded down to security issues, and I will explain later. Now, specific to defense and security, some of the countries, the countries affected responded in several ways, or affected in several ways. One, most of its military forces were repurposed for pandemic response. In some countries, including us, there was an issue of over-securitization, the pandemic response, due to the overuse of military forces. Multilateral exercises and events were canceled for everybody. So you didn't see in the Philippines us having the Balikatan or the other military exercises that we used to have during the second semester of the year. There is also an impact on defense spending, particularly on modernization, as funds were realigned to pandemic response. Now, there is also an impact on the operational tempo and readiness of military forces, which are affected by the spread of the virus. To some extent, some units that were infected were no longer viable for employment in the pandemic response. Now, let's shift back to China. It exacerbated the ongoing US-China trade war. And the trade war actually has nothing to do with economics. When America realized that the source of PPEs and medicine is only from China, it has become a national security concern. The US is now shifting its focus from China itself to the Communist Party of China. So there's some form of target that they're targeting, or their focus of effort as far as the contention with China is now being narrowed down towards leadership issues. The statement of Secretary Pompeo and the Australian government debunking the China's 9-dash line in the South China Sea was a very crucial event, development in the region. Also, the US-Taiwan relations moved toward the next level with the formal visit of US officials in Taiwan, the provision for arms and defense on the island, and the signing of the Taiwan Act into law with focus on the pandemic response. China-EU relations took a step backward, reflecting on the failure of their so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. And China has to walk back on this effort by sending its foreign minister to talk with EU states. On the other hand, here in ASEAN, China has renewed interest in completing the Code of Conduct and has even sent its defense minister to talk with the ASEAN states to complement what they're doing in the EU states. What happened now with ASEAN? ASEAN is caught right now is caught in the middle. We are being wooed by two powers using the following mechanisms. China is trying to use the COC to bring ASEAN into its orbit and to push away US from the South China Sea. The US, on the other hand, is using the Pompeo statement of July to promote ASEAN alignment with US in the South China Sea issue. On the third question that was provided to me, if any changes have occurred, what do you expect to do to be resulting in terms of challenges, opportunities? Is there anything that countries in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia, that needs to be done to address the situation? Now, looking at everything now in terms of challenge and opportunities, the principal challenges to the region are: one, the impact of the US-China strategic competition with respect to ASEAN. How do we deal with two major powers in rivalry over the region's waters, particularly the South China Sea and the East China Sea? How do we recover? How will the economies recover despite the pandemic? Because it provides a distraction. In a way, it provides a distraction from the emerging regional security environment. And unless they have a sustainable solution to the pandemic, meaning a vaccine, this will be an ongoing concern. The last one we have to challenge is the Chinese influence operations impact on domestic politics and national security. Because China is trying to walk back on its the effects of the negative effects on its international standing due to the pandemic. It has leveled up its influence operations to promote the Chinese narrative to the international audience. Now, in terms of opportunity, I think China right now is more open to discussion at this stage. For one, because of the negative international standing. Second, they're also affected by food shortage and the need to recover lost grounds diplomatically from the pandemic. Now, speaking from a practitioner perspective, we need to look at the possibility of the vulnerability of President Xi Jinping internally within the party as an effect of his performance during the pandemic, before and during. The U.S. elections is a chance. The oncoming US presidential elections is also a chance for the region to review its security posture. Then we are looking now at a possibility of bipolarity in the Indo-Pacific region, with China and possibly Russia in tandem versus the Indo-Pacific quadrilateral made up of US, India, Australia, and Japan, and 3 other states from EU, UK, Germany, and France. And a bipolarized region will not be a good thing for the region on the long term. It's bound to increase the tension further that we are observing right now. Now, how will ASEAN step up given this regional security environment? Now, ideally, ASEAN should step up in the sense of trying to develop itself as a countervailing balance to the US-China competition. It has already several mechanisms in place that it can use to improve its posture. It has the ASEAN Regional Forum. It has the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, which is an informal setup, as well as the Major Services Forum as well, also informal setups. China and ASEAN can either just be an irrelevant bystander in the emerging strategic conditions, or it can be an active player by being a balancer to the US and the China. But that all depends on how the ASEAN as an institution will comport itself given these challenges and opportunities. With that, I end, and thank you and good morning.
Thank you, sir, for that succinct but interesting discussion. Given a black swan event such as the coronavirus disease, there have been changes in the strategic environment which carry significant implications to several countries in the region. As a major undercurrent of most issues surrounding conflict and security in the region, we have heard about US-China strategic competition as a factor in the discussion. So we have also heard a bit about the economic decoupling of the US from China and its connections to security issues between the two countries and their partners, which I am sure some of you already have questions on. So Admiral Ong also raised important prospects and challenges, such as China being open to discussion at this point, the possible changes in operational tempo brought about by the US elections, and the multilateral mechanisms for security amid a possible bipolar Indo-Pacific region. Moving on, our second speaker is a tenured assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines. His areas of interests include ASEAN studies, Chinese politics, and public policy. So let us welcome Professor Jaime B. Naval.
Thank you, Diane. I'd like to start my presentation by, it's a bit poetic, a narrative. It's just a few lines. Consider the following. There's a ship on fire, and we need all the help we can. Some have buckets, others have hoses, others have boat. We draw water from the same source. We are standing in the same platform. We are in the same ship. How do we solve the problem? As a Filipino observer of the geopolitical security developments in Southeast Asia, the year 2012 is a landmark in examining the region. Scarborough Shoal in the summer of that year was a milestone, and then thereafter there were other important developments, particularly the defiant, unbridled actions pursued by China through its massive damaging construction and swarming frenzies in the South China Sea. Fast forward a few years further down the line. From the categorical PCA ruling, which nullified China's 9-dash line claim, and up until its many pretexts for base building and fortifications in the disputed area, China, along with the regional states and other concerned stakeholders, remain key in resolving the leading challenges in the East Southeast Asian hemisphere. From one conventional perspective, the developments taking place in our region, pre-pandemic and right now with the pandemic, are mere expected outcomes of patterned behavior, largely. This behavior, repeated, intensified, forebodes dangerous possibilities, which may or may not be planned, more so desired. and yet it may lead to situations which are inimical to the interests of the stakeholders in our region. The current juncture is not only defining, it is disquieting and challenging. The binarial classification of traditional and non-traditional threats has not become interesting. Has not only become interesting, it has become more complex and has attained full meaning. The more sophisticated analysts, in the not so distant time, state institutions would normally have a few facets to examine when they would like to study and analyze national and international security. But those days are much bygone. Following the end of the Cold War in the 1990s and the US privileged status as a lone superpower, the world has for some time accepted, albeit without complaining, not without complaining, on the status quo that pervaded. But then time does not stop, and the countries move on, and we witness regionalism intensifying not only in Europe, but also elsewhere, especially in the Americas, Australia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. As the Chinese dynamo plodded on, it engendered deeper trade and investment relations in Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. And Deng Xiaoping's advice to hide and bide for China can no longer be pursued because China has developed great muscle and economic clout. Domestically, the sustained development of China translated to the legitimization even more of the Communist Party. And the profits of China's revisionist capitalism yielded necessary fuel for social, political, and even military advancement. That China has earned enviable stature is proved no less by the US belated and frustrated effort to pivot in the Asia Pacific. The Trump administration no less called out China and pursued its brand of trade war, which is not without its negative externalities. Even supposed established partners in Europe and Asia had been adversely affected by the constant effort of the US to be back to number one or to remain number one, to be numero uno. For all the assurances on the Indo-Pacific Partnership as founded on the pillars of law, on the rule of law, pursuit of economic prosperity, and commitment for peace and stability, strip of the political officiousness, the Quad members communicate a message of preemptive counterweight, ready to militarily call out China in the extended region. Although how far or up to what cost these powers would willingly contribute to their common causes is subject to future unraveling. US State Secretary Mike Pompeo intimated, and I quote, "Once we have institutionalized what we are doing, the four of us together, we can begin to build out a true security framework." So in other words, what we're seeing right now is not something that has been designed with a master plan. There's an element of, pardon the word, adhocracy at the moment, as it is still an evolving, very fluid arrangement that these Quad powers have. Observers must, however, and this was pointed out by Admiral Jude Ong earlier, I agree with the observation. Observers must, however, monitor the role and measures of Russia, among others, in the movements taking place on the disputed grounds or waters or in the offices itself of the UN Security Council. Sino-Russo Confederacy is being strongly cemented. In the East China Sea, Russian aircraft apparently testing the waters for China on the disputed Senkakus have caused Japanese and even South Korean military to scramble their assets. Sino-Russo strategic partnership in the economic field is already an established fact. Aside from the South China Sea, which invites regular and incisive readings, given the delicate potential to spark a conflict, the Taiwan Strait and the East China Sea remain tinderboxes. These require close monitoring. Miscalculations can easily transform the delicate holding modus vivendi into a conflagration. With their formidable military ability and posturing, particularly countries like Japan, Taiwan, and of course China, human error or misguided intention can radically alter the tenuous circumstances. With with Taiwan's reputedly rogue province status and its rekindled special relations with the US, China is hard pressed to more gingerly manage its posturing across the Taiwan Strait. The recent reinforced rounds of phone-ups in the Taiwan Strait, particularly as demonstrated by the guided destroyer USS Barry, merited not just heightened rhetoric of, quote, of necessary response, unquote, from China, but also serious display of military power in the area. We recall that 18 Chinese aircraft buzzed the island, Taiwan, and breached the sensitive midline of the Taiwan Strait. Related to the Indo-Pacific campaign, the US has already announced a game changer that would expand US naval power to more than 355 ships from the current 293. Also included in its so-called Future Forward campaign is the inclusion of unmanned and autonomous ships, submarines, and aircraft that would enable the US to, quote, survive high-intensity conflict, unquote. No doubt, China's pervasive economic footprint in our region places it in dear terms with Southeast Asia. No doubt that its fortifications and other acts of intimidation in the South China Sea defy its claimed benevolence as a major power. No doubt also that as it claims it is sui generis, a different power, that it has proved on several occasions its wiliness and even compulsively misplaced assertiveness. Although there's still debate on whether China has indeed intensified its South China Sea campaign while the rest of the world battles COVID-19, with some experts expounding that China too is responding to the dynamics taking place in the disputed South China Sea area, to say the least. China has been unrelenting in its assertiveness, pandemic or none. On the defense facet of security, the persisting tensions in the region instigate continued military expenditure, particularly among the more affluent and can afford players. Taiwan is deliberating a 14.42 billion US defense budget for next year, which reflects a whopping 10% increase over the current year. While scrapping a $4.2 billion missile system, owing to the certain technical issues, Japan is proceeding with other advanced force multiplier purchases, such as 100, getting 105 F-35 stealth fighters for $23 billion. Meanwhile, the US has signaled its intent to deploy long-range precision fires, such as hypersonic missiles and tactical fires with extended range to combat China's A2/AD strategy in the South China Sea. But beyond the inventorying of state-of-the-art defense weaponry and notable arms sales, supplier-buyer relations, one cannot help but notice the Trump administration's approach to traditional allies. On one end, the view that deeper cooperation between the US and its allies will be critical as competition with China persists. And on the other hand, the unilateralist impulse of the United States under Trump that is highly skeptical about the value and fairness of alliances. Clarity with mixed chaos, as some would call the US approach under Trump, who reason, however, that that having a poorly implemented but fundamentally correct strategy is better than having a well implemented but ambiguous strategy. So analysts are saying it's much better to have a poorly independent but correct strategy than one that was well implemented but ambiguous. So this brings the debate about strategic ambiguity and strategic clarity. Uh, we see the disposition or the predilection of the United States now under Trump to be fearing more on strategic clarity as its modus operandi of choice, and departing seemingly at the moment or by posturing on strategic ambiguity. And I'll be cutting my own presentation in a couple of lines by asking questions on the Chinese part. In the past, when countries, particularly major powers, would do estimates on their war capabilities, the question that would be asked is how many wars can a superpower like the United States or any great power wage simultaneously? And going back to my earlier narrative on the ship on fire, I'd like to ask just how many fires can one giant put out? Given China's leading involvements on leading disputes in the larger region, one wonders how many fires China can adequately afford at a time. From a purely rational actor and Sun Tzu's perspective, China would prefer avoiding violent confrontations. With Quad, Taiwan, and Japan as the bigger protagonists, and not to mention the goodwill that would greatly suffer from any violence, that China would suffer from any violence that may occur in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea or in Taiwan, China would want to keep relations on level footing as much as possible. On a number of cases, Xi Jinping has lambasted the United States for its, among others, trade war direction. But we notice, however, that China has not directly even named, Xi Jinping has not directly even named Trump in his latest speeches where he would castigate the US for its onerous and very troublesome trade war. Uh, Analysts are saying that this might be an indication or a sign that Xi Jinping or China in general is giving room for backpedaling so that in case some backroom redemptive negotiations can take place, the US can be able to navigate itself on a U-turn. In the case of Shinzo Abe, as he decided to step down owing to health reasons, the Chinese Foreign Ministry took to Twitter to, quote, appreciate PM Shinzo Abe's efforts to improve China-Japan relations, unquote. In commemorating what traditionally would be an opportunity for China to lambast Japan for its aggression in the World War II, Beijing cited no scathing criticism at Japan and instead segued to anti-American discourse. In his first ever telephone exchange with Japan's new Prime Minister, Xi Jinping iterated, and I quote, China stands ready to work with the new Japanese government to properly handle key sensitive issues, including historical ones, to continue to enhance the political mutual trust, deepen mutually beneficial cooperation, and expand people-to-people exchanges. In his other meetings and exchanges with Sugo, the the Chinese President Xi Jinping has intimated that China is even willing to go on some very special economic, trade, investment, and technology arrangements with Japan. What's the point of bringing all this out? It points indirectly to the question that I asked regarding how many fires can China manage. It does not. It is not ready to engage in simultaneous fires. It is even trying to navigate a position where it is trying to woo even Japan and even sending out feelers that it is open to renegotiating, of course, under certain conditions, the trade war and the other complex issues in the relationship with with the United States at the moment. I think I would stop here. I have some other points, but I think I would be, if given the chance, I might be mentioning this in the Q&A, and even maybe they may be asked, so I'll right away respond to the questions. I'll stop at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Naval. So in that short but insightful presentation, we can see that the complexity of the strategic environment has caused us to think and rethink the patterns of state behavior that we have seen through the years. So it's important for us to note that Professor Naval also discussed that fluidity is a major factor that impacts connections and dynamics between countries. which just increases uncertainty and unpredictability in the way competition and cooperation is happening among players. So we have also heard a bit about strategic clarity and strategic ambiguity, which is something very interesting to hear about in the discussion and Q&A that will follow. So at this point, if I can remind our attendees, both in the Zoom webinar and Facebook live stream, please post your questions both in the Q&A tab and the comment section respectively. So with that, we will now begin with our open forum. So we'll start with a question for both speakers. Most scholars looking at the current strategic environment have noted significant changes that increases the unpredictability of regional relations. There have been references to the prospect of an unforeseen and unexpected event that could slide into a crisis. 3 questions regarding this. So first, do you see any scenario along these lines that is the most dangerous as far as the region's security and stability is concerned? Second, what is it that needs to be done in order to prevent these potential crises from escalating further? And as a rejoinder, how concerned should we be regarding these scenarios? So may I ask Admiral Ong to answer first, to be followed by Professor Naval.
Well, first of all, I would tend to believe that both the US and China are rational actors, and they would not go into a situation that would lead to conflict. However, you cannot, one unforeseen possibility would be a tactical miscalculation on the ground, which could escalate into a sort of a crisis. But transitioning from a crisis to a shooting war, I don't think that would happen in the immediate future. There is no appetite for that, and there is no benefit, I think, for both countries, for both major powers. I don't see them looking at it as a beneficial event in any case. Thank you.
So, sir, just an addition to that, what do you think is it that needs to be done in order to prevent these crises from escalating?
Unfortunately, they are not talking to each other politically. But I know for a fact that there are back channel mechanisms between the U.S. and the Chinese militaries that provides an opportunity for operational and tactical commanders to talk to each other and ensure that nothing would be of such incident would escalate further. Okay, so looking at it from 2 layers, I think on the military side, operational side, there are mechanisms in place for that.
Thank you, sir. So, Professor Naval?
The analogy that I use in a part of my presentation is that of these disputes are effectively tinder boxes, and they are powder kegs. From a rational actor perspective, no one would, it is not in the interest of any of these involved countries to spark a conflagration. But as the tension rises and the exchanges become more heated, even if they are just for acoustic purposes, the situation on the ground is different from the policy making or the armchair policy making, the convenient policy making that takes place in the capital of these countries. Take the case, for example, last April, we have this incident of the Vietnamese boat being rammed by the Chinese. This is reminiscent of what happened with Jember that we had also in the summer of 2019. As Admiral correctly pointed out, it is at the tactical level where mistakes and errors can take place. And the more that the exchanges, rhetoric and movement, particularly naval or even other forms of military activities, assertiveness continue and are even intensified, you prompt or you engender the risk of having accidents. So ang tanong lang, if this do happen, are they really accidents? From a strict policy-making perspective, they would be accidents. But from a maybe even a pedestrian point of view, these accidents are developments that were waiting to happen, which were conduced by the brinkmanship that countries are doing. So what to do to preempt or prevent this? Diplomacy is a still very useful uh, path to take. There should be not only more frequent exchanges, official and by a back channel, but also we should not be constraining other participants who have equal stakes in the South China Sea, as is the case we're talking about, to be prevented from the dialogue. Uh, Admiral Ong talked about the ASEAN as being caught in the middle, particularly of this U.S.-China rivalry. But I think it cuts two ways, both ways. ASEAN has been priding itself, and correctly so in many aspects, of adhering and wanting to keep on the ASEAN centrality in discourses on security matters. So ASEAN, true to its claim, now is in a what do you call that uh, in a fulfilling in a prophetic sense that it's at the middle and right there, it's central to the discussion that should be taking place. I'd like to note, this is one thing that I was not able to, that I wanted to include in my presentation, but I cut myself so that I won't be taking up much time. But the idea of an ASEAN that is able to come up with a coherent, unified position maybe is something that we would welcome. However, at the moment, we know that ASEAN, by virtue of asymmetries in interests and relationships vis-a-vis the great powers, vis-a-vis the direct stakeholdership in the South China Sea, these asymmetries exist. But nonetheless, if we were to move the clock forward, and here there will be philosophical debates on whether you'd be Hobbesian, Kantian, or Grotian. If you are Hobbesian, then I might appear very less pessimist or pessimistic. If you are Kantian, you would appear to be less optimist. And I think it's more of a Grotian calculus that we may have to adopt for ASEAN to value itself not in its relationship along with the other countries, but in its own, in minding its own future. If ASEAN would be able to mind itself and foster a more unified, coherent, not all the time, and that's difficult, then it will become a player that would be that would be treated with greater respect. At the moment, ASEAN is not able to coherently bring its act together, and so that's one problem. But nonetheless, I do not think that ASEAN is bereft of the opportunity to do that, but it has to do so in order to respond more effectively and become an actor of central importance in the unsettled disputes in our region.
Thank you for that, sir. So for the next round, we will be having a question for both speakers again. So not surprisingly, we are very much focused on events that take place in the East and South China Sea. But should we also be concerned about what is going on in the Indian Ocean, as well as the border tensions between India and China? This was mentioned by Admiral Ong, but maybe, sir, you can answer this first.
Well, we can look at it from the point of view of China and US differently. Now, the question that begs the question: why is China initiating so many issues around its borders? Given the onset of pandemic, okay, so is it a distraction or is it using the pandemic as an opportunity, as a crisis to gain some advantage in an opportunistic manner? Okay. Now, if I would ante up the problem or the situation in the Indian Ocean, I will do so to distract the United States, because it forces the U.S. to instead of concentrating forces in the South China Sea, it will be forced to dissipate its forces. It's already dissipated forces, and it will be further dissipated if something happens in the Indian Ocean. Okay? That's for one. For the US, they need to do something about the Indian Ocean, so that's why they're trying to engage India, okay, to have a more robust working relationship with the Indian government as far as the looking after the Indian Ocean is concerned, because they also realize that they can only tweak their forces so much. At some point, it loses its lethality by being everywhere. Okay, so that's the challenge: how to balance, how to calibrate your act. For US, it's how to calibrate its actions in the Indian Ocean so that it will not affect the main theater of concern, which is the South China Sea, East China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So maybe Professor Naval for his...
There's this debate, or it's not yet a debate in the strict sense, but there's this exchanges on what kind of a security arrangement or environment are we going to be headed? Are we headed right now with the rivalry between these two great powers? Will it be a bipolar or a multipolar? The foreign external Minister for External Affairs, I think that's how they call it in India, has made the point in one of the recent meetings of the Quad that the Quad is transforming to something like ushering in multipolarity, contrary to the idea that it's bipolar, but not bipolar because of one power alone, but bipolar in terms of a fellowship or an alliance of states like Japan, Australia, US, and India. The, the challenge of the Indo-Pacific concept is now, the challenge to the Indo-Pacific is now coming to pass. How far, for example, in a bilateral dispute, for example, that China and India are engaged in, conflict actually has already erupted, how far will the Quad members commit to assist and a party to the agreement, which is actually why I say even the Quad is somehow ad hoc at the moment. Because there is no complete, there is no master plan that would tell us what it really wants in particular, but maybe a feeling of the situation and what they can tentatively contribute to the effort. The generic idea being that China would have to be regulated or contained, if not managed. I remember in last week, and even before that, Chinese foreign minister, even at the time when the pandemic is still continuing and having its second wave or so in a number of the Southeast Asian countries, had a 5-day, 4-country swing in Southeast Asia. Before that, our very own Secretary of Foreign Affairs visited China, and this is still in the middle of a pandemic. I'm instead of answering the question, I raise a question. What do you think is so important that our Foreign Affairs Secretary would have to go to Beijing in order to meet his counterpart? And what is so important that right now we could do conferences in Zoom, that the Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi, would have to visit all these countries, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Cambodia. There must be something that is occurring parallel along with the developments in the Quad, which has a number of meetings recently too. So it's like you're playing at the moment. Sorry, it's not completely applicable. But is there a last 2 minutes before the middle of before the break of the game that China is doing right now, we wonder what has been offered as a carrot or dangled as an incentive for Southeast Asia, these countries, to listen even more closely to this shuttle diplomacy that China has been doing lately. It's interesting to note, and I think because we're not part of the inner circle, it pays to ask what is taking place right now. It must be very important, interestingly.
Thank you for raising those points, Professor Naval. And now, steeping in a little bit to the Philippine response to this very fluid strategic environment, coming up with probably the Quad and other issues about US elections in China. So two related and interesting questions came in from Mr. Santiago Castillo of the NSC. So first, in light of the PRC's military development and in light of the enduring geopolitical and strategic challenges, as you mentioned, should the Philippines already ramp up its defense industry development? And related to that, he also mentioned that AFP modernization has long been overdue, and the paradigm shift from internal to external security capabilities has been viewed as necessary in light of the challenges in the region. So can these delays be attributed due to the Philippines' leadership being more familiar and focused with counterinsurgency and counterterrorism? So I am sure Admiral Ong would want to answer these questions, but maybe we could also ask Professor Naval to answer them. Sirs?
Ako muna. Well, for the defense industry, that has long been discussed, and there are studies being made currently, as far as I know. So it's not something new, but that defense industry is something that we should have done years ago. Kumbaga, we need that yesterday. Okay. Now, defense industry requires collaboration not between government, business, and even academia. One of the critical components of an industry is yung research and development. And it is something that we have not invested in, even in previous endeavors. In the component of modernization, R&D is we try to be a free rider in R&D, in the R&D component, but it's something that should government or the business side should invest in. It will actually encourage development yung STEM education natin. If you look at it downstream, no. In fact, before I left the Navy, we started collaborating with the UP on research and development. And ang kausap, we were talking to the current chancellor right now, who was then the VP for research, I think. On the modernization aspect of the AFP, you have to look at the problem is the construct of the AFP, and you have to compare that with the development, let's say, of the Philippine Coast Guard. Okay. The acquisition process of the Coast Guard is much more simpler because it only has to deal with one layer, the Department of Transportation. And for the AFP, if you want to modernize, let's say, for external defense, the Navy and the Air Force, it has to go through several layers. And in the decision-making process, it's a competition of argument between 3 services. 4 if you include General Headquarters. So it's a much more convoluted deliberative process. But transitioning the modernization from internal to external, that has been agreed upon already several years ago. And the AFP is on, DND and the AFP is on track on that. But because of the pandemic, which is Black Swan event, modernization was affected also in terms of budget. Okay. So that's why I think a substantial portion of the modernization program budget was realigned for pandemic response for this year. So it hampered the already much delayed process of modernization. Okay. Thank you.
Professor Naval, sir?
I do not claim any expertise regarding defense putting up on managing the defense industry, but some practical observations. I forgot the name of the Korean company which is situated in Subic. What's the name of that? Is it Hanjin?
Yes.
Yes, it's
Hanjin.
Hanjin. Uh, it happens that we have a pandemic and ships demand for ships and the shipping services have declined for the moment. But it's like when you buy stocks, no? You don't buy stocks when they're expensive. You buy stocks when they're down, assuming all things being equal. Um, it behooves on our government to provide vision and political will, and then to enjoin private sector or even foreign companies like Hanjin or whoever is a counterpart who are the other shipbuilders in the world. We are an archipelago. This is my take on our defense strategy and even our defense doctrine. We are an archipelago, but our defense doctrines ever since has always been continental in nature. We have 7,100 islands, and how do you connect them? No matter how many bridges you do, you still cannot ignore that we have coast, waters, maritime zones to protect, to tap, and to be responsible for. Uh, Even not so emphasizing on the profits or the positive externalities of having a shipbuilding capacity or shipbuilding industry from a very practical point of view that we have our people man most of the ships across the planet. Then it is, I think it's a matter of adequately responding to our constants, including our archipelagicity, that we should have shipbuilding. And shipbuilding can have dual role or dual purpose for peacetime transport and also uh, for preparations in case you need to go to war. At the same time, we will still continue to confront the demand, this necessity to bring in ships that would connect, that will defend, that will protect our country. Most of the time, when we are talking about tensions in the region, we always see the South China Sea as a sort of automatic shoe-in and all the others. But not only that, we have on our eastern hemisphere the the the, the now we call it on the Philippine Sea side. I forgot the term, the exact term. We have to manage the 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 entitlements and the privileges that we have received on our maritime legacies, especially by view of the UNCLOS. We will need more of these assets to fly and protect. So uh, right away, there's a demand, but you have to program it because, of course, you don't have money for it right away. But there has to be a plan and the political will, along with tapping the businessmen who would be able to see through the strategic necessities of putting up these businesses or industries. If San Miguel can put up this multi-billion airport complex in Bulacan, it can look even much further on the horizon and look at the greater waters that the Philippines will have to address. And we need more ships for that. We don't, buying is not always, should not be the first option all the time.
And Sir Rommel, if you could add anything.
Just a rejoinder, no? Defense is a public good, so it people tend to look at it as a cost. Okay? When you do a cost-benefit analysis, it's a cost. But if you look at defense industry as a component of defense, it should be also considered as a positive input to the economy. Okay? The military, or even to extend it, even the police, are not the only customers for a defense industry. You can actually, if you are to develop a very robust and very yung superior product, you can actually export it. Okay, and in a way that would now contribute to your economy. So it has to, you have to look at the defense industry with yung defense component as a sort of a silent word. But look at it as an industry. And look at it from the point of view of how do I expand this. If you compare yung sa PT PAL in Indonesia, it used to be their naval shipyard also. Okay. But they had yung air aviation industry nila, they copied it from us, yung PADC, yung Philippine Aerospace Development Corporation. They copied that, and now they are building our aircraft for us, and they are building ships for us. Taking also into consideration that we have superior technicians and fabricators, okay, based in Cebu and based in Subic, and yet we are losing out on this, in this type of industries. So it needs number one, it needs a buy-in from the top. Two, industry should contribute in terms of looking at how to make it viable. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir. So while we're discussing and focusing more on the military, an interesting question came from Mr. Georgie of the International Crisis Group. So coming back to the issue of a tactical misencounter, which was mentioned by Admiral Ong a while ago, and the specter of a quick crisis, considering US and China may need to control their operators and find channels to diffuse tension, how about a scenario of an altercation between China and countries such as Vietnam, Philippines, or Malaysia, be it through an accident involving the Coast Guard, a fishing ship, or an oil rig, or a deliberate provocation by China? So given these heightened emotions or tensions, could such an incident genuinely unsettle the fragile balance that we have currently?
Okay, let me answer first now. First of all, in all PLA Navy ships and all Chinese Coast Guard vessels, there are two important people on board. That's the captain and the political officer. Okay. There is always a political officer aboard ship. Okay. So there is no such thing as a quote-unquote accident in the South China Sea involving a Chinese naval vessel or a Chinese Coast Guard vessel, if it is not premeditated or under instructions from the Central Committee through the party. Okay. The Jember incident was a sort of a black swan event among fisher folks. I don't think they wanted it to happen, but I think there was sort of it's more of a professional issue on the part of the mariners or the persons manning that Chinese vessel involved in the accident that led to that incident. But nothing is an accident in the South China Sea if it involves Chinese government vessels, because the political officer on board will make sure that the captain will toe the line. Okay, thank you.
Sir Naval, if you have any comments on that.
Trying to see the question in the panel. The question was, let me see. Could not see it right now.
More of the involvement, yes, sir.
Now I am seeing. Okay. If an accident occurs, in effect, what will happen? Will it right away upset or conflagrate the situation? Two ways. You have to see the context. If the parties involved, particularly, let's have another Jember or something like what happened in April. Another Vietnam says it was rammed by the Chinese. These are already accidents by themselves. Why has it not transformed or mutated into something that would be continuing the downward spiral? I think both parties have seen, or at the moment see, the futility of causing a further downward spiral. But put it in another case, if any of the party would really want to deliberately find it in its interest to worsen or complicate the situation, then right away, instead of saying, okay, you have to use a fire extinguisher so that that would be put out, maybe for those who have fertile minds and malignant intents, they would even put gasoline on it. So it's not an accident per se, but that possibility is ever present. What if? Uh, Good that you may have political officers on Chinese vessels. What about the other countries who may not have political officers, who may not have that clear or direct communication line with the central powers? So we don't want to leave that to chance. So again, it will depend on the other specifics, whether that would be you douse more gasoline or you put you use a fire extinguisher.
Thank you for that, sir. So currently, we are now down to our last three questions, given the time. So I'll throw in first two questions, and then we can look at the third question as a prompt for both our speakers to give their final thoughts later. So for the first two questions, how do you see the US elections impacting cooperation and competition in the region? So in relation to this, will the US confrontation with China continue or even intensify with a Biden administration? And the second question is, in observing the ongoing estimation of both US and China of the situation in the South China Sea, and with the pandemic still wreaking havoc in the region, how do you see the role of the so-called middle powers in security of the region? So maybe Admiral Ong, again, can go first, followed by Professor Naval.
President Trump is using, is against alliances. Okay, that's his moniker na. He doesn't work. He doesn't like to work, particularly if he looks at the alliance as a free rider mechanism. Okay, so as a businessman, he looks at it in terms of cost benefit. If I am giving you support, you should pay for my support. Okay, that's how he thinks. Now, Trump's administration is attacking China in a different way, or confronting China in a different way. I believe that it's using the trade war as a means to separate the Chinese population from the Chinese Communist Party. Okay. Then it's isolating the party in such a way. I think what they're trying to do is trying to force an internal regime change by placing President Xi Jinping in a situation in which the party may look at the President Xi Jinping more of a liability rather than as a benefit to the party. Okay, that's I think how Trump's administration is looking at it. Biden, on the other hand, being a Democrat, would look more into alliances or multilateral approaches to addressing China. So I think with Biden, we will see a greater cooperation between US and ASEAN, or US and the European Union or NATO, for that matter. So I think that's the dichotomy between the two presidential candidates. Okay. Yung second question.
Sir, the second question is about the role of the middle powers in security in the region.
Well, right now, because of at some point before the Pompeo statement of July, there was a narrative that America is basically not interested in protecting or helping us in the Asia-Pacific region. So you actually saw a rise on the middle powers. And who are they? Japan coming into the fore, basically. Okay. Australia, belatedly, and not in such a greater degree as in Japan. But if you look at Japan as the sort of gold standard of middle power engagement, you would have noticed from last year up to today, they have actually upped the ante in terms of engaging the other countries, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia. So they are also conducting their own shuttle diplomacy outside of US US umbrella. Okay, for their own interest, of course. And you also see heavily yung Japanese movement of naval vessels in the South China Sea also. So that's the middle power, I think, adjustment with a diminished US presence. But after the July statement of Pompeo and the increase of tempo of the United States Navy here in the South China Sea, you're now looking at the conditions that would strengthen the Quad. Okay. As Professor Navala said earlier, the Quad started out like the horse before, the cart before the horse. Okay. Nauna yung narrative of the Quad before actually there was a discussion on the Quad among the four countries. Okay. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Naval?
I'd like to, with your permission, I'd like to go back to the earlier question regarding what would happen if there's an accident or there's provocation. Because I recall on many instances, the Indonesian government, when it would be able to catch ships illegally fishing along the Natuna area, which is arguably still part of the wider Greater South China Sea, although Indonesia says it does not have any dispute, but as part of its traditional fishing ground and entitlements, the Indonesian government has reiterated that. And on a number of cases, when Chinese fishing boats would be caught illegally fishing, although of course they would insist that they're still part of the South China Sea. And one of the controversial endings of such apprehension would be the Indonesian government would burn the ship. This is deliberate policy to give intruders or poachers a strong, unforgettable lesson. Consider if that would have happened by accident or by deliberate decision in the Philippines. Boy, I would imagine that the same stimulus will have a different response on China, and repercussions would really be felt in many different facets. So just to answer, I was saying it's not the incident per se. You have to look into the context. Context there is China has a different type of relationship with Indonesia or even Malaysia. We have a saying in the country, iba yung tinitingnan, iba yung tinititigan. So it depends on the context. Then as to the impact of should Biden win the presidency, my thinking is harping on the rational actor model. There would be greater constancy and not so much abruptness or bravado in policymaking. I do not see Biden being as rash or narcissistic and unpredictable as Trump. If there's this debate that Trump would like the alliances to hold, but then it's on the premise that the allies would shoulder a big chunk of the funds that would be needed to keep the operations. I do not think that Biden would drop the alliance. In fact, what we see is while Trump says, "Oh, alliance is okay, but you have to shoulder no pre-riding," it is becoming perceived as more of a checkbook arrangement and not commitment to shoulder responsibility. Japan, if I'm not mistaken, has in its one of the accountings that I've read, the U.S. for maintaining its bases in Japan, the U.S. is now already defraying only 10% of the total cost. 86 plus or around 90% is now shouldered as to maintenance of the operations of the bases. So, but I do not see that other countries, Korea may want to somehow level and show some parity with the demands of a Trump administration. But I would imagine that there are interests that could not be right away be given at prices. What's the value of keeping the South China Sea open and for countries to cooperate, not to make it accessible to everyone? I don't think you could write. You could estimate the cost, but you will not limit it to the nominal dollar sign that you would have. As to the role of middle powers, Japan would, if the US is slacking or the US is found wanting in the alliance, Japan, particularly under the administration of Shinzo Abe, has very creatively and adroitly managed to win over the countries in the region. And you don't hear China uh, issuing statements to the point of easing out Japan. The byline of China is that keep out all non-regional powers. But of course, if it wants to single out particularly a middle power like Japan, then it would say, as to the South China Sea, Japan has no business participating. But it has not been given that statement. So Japan has a good credibility and track record and sends a clear message on where it stands on the South China Sea with the others in the region. Australia is sort of a mini shadow of the United States in wanting to keep the freedom of navigation, although we would observe, particularly when earlier, maybe in the 2010s, I've been participating in a number of conferences with Australia and with China. Australia for some time was not so loud because of the economic relationship. So apparently, with some backward movement or reduction in their economic relationship, now Australia can speak more vocally. Canada, it's far, but it has interest to keep the waterways open. So just the same, but not in the same intensity and interest as Japan is showing in the region.
Thank you, sir. So with this last question, I hope our speakers could also give their final thoughts as we close this broadcast. So one gets the impression from both presentations that the COVID-19 pandemic has had very little impact on the strategic environment. So both speakers have pointed out that there were already pre-existing conditions shaping the strategic situation, even before the pandemic. So, but is the pandemic really immaterial to the developments we are discussing? So maybe Admiral Ong can answer first and probably give your final thoughts as we close this podcast, and probably to be followed by Professor Napal.
The pandemic was actually a game changer. No? I'm sorry if I conveyed a different message earlier. No? But if you look at the nitty-gritty of the regional developments, the pandemic is like an overlay. It's a thin overlay that actually accentuated or highlighted the tensions already existing. But in a sense, it's a game changer, particularly as it affects China. Number one, there was now a sudden realization because that with China as the center of the global supply chain, it has already national security implications on different countries. Okay, and I took an example of yung medicines. The medicines, U.S. suddenly realized that most of their medicines are being manufactured in China. Most of their PPEs or protective gears are actually coming from China. So, and China was hoarding at some point early in the pandemic. They were actually hoarding this medical equipment and the medicines because they also need it for themselves. Okay. With that realization, it transitioned over to security issues. The pandemic to the economy, then to regional security. Okay. Now, and one of the most telling effects was the decision, or at least there was this narrative, of getting out of China some of the industries or the investments. So there is a narrative of some of the investments of Japan being encouraged to go back to Japan or to go to Southeast Asia. Okay, so now the pandemic caused that realization. Okay, and the second impact to China is the international standing niya. That's why you will see their foreign minister, defense ministers conducting, as Professor Navarro said, they are on shuttle diplomacy mode. Because they are now in damage control mode. They're trying to mitigate yung effects the effect on their credibility and standing as a nation or as a state in the international community. So they're trying to mitigate the ill effects of the pandemic, the response, their lack of transparency, and the consequent actions nila after the pandemic onset. Okay. And I don't know if that affected at some point the reasoning or the decision of the three particular EU countries, UK, Germany, and France, to make a stand as far as the South China Sea issue is concerned. I don't have any data to correlate, but I think the fact that China, their perception of China has changed over time, it may have contributed to the decision that is kasi before they were vacillating whether not to harm China relations, but here you see a clear distinct posture that is obviously going to hurt their relation with China, and yet they took that direction. Okay, so I think in a way the pandemic was a game changer as far as regional security environment as it affects China, but not necessarily for everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Naval?
I remember a question that was asked in the last week's Katipunan Conference, and it was asked of Professor J. Batumbakal, what would prompt or jolt ASEAN or the region to more collaborate even more in responding to this security concerns and the like, even have further institutionalization coordination as in responses. And the answer that he gave was crisis. I do agree with that in part, but the literature and the empirical data tells us that not all crises lead to reforms. The crisis must be of such proportion in terms of delving and affecting the interests of all and generating the political will of the parties concerned. Go back to pre-pandemic. For the past 2 years, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore-based, has done 2 surveys, almost annual, on perceptions by distinguished group of Southeast Asian Southeast Asians. And in the last one, which was, I think, released in January or December, and that's still pre-pandemic, shows that, and consistent with the first survey, that a lot of people, these are people from across different disciplines or professions, but mostly think tanks, policymaking, and the like, the level of mistrust in China is considerable. In the first one, China had the highest level of mistrust. The same was evident as a pattern in the second one. Trust in the U.S. has declined also, and it was, if I read correctly, because Trump's inconsistency and very, what do you call that, mercurial way of handling things. But the pandemic is a game changer in the sense that, one, it disrupted not only the public health system of all countries around the planet, but from an economic sense, it also bring to the fore the disadvantage of having much of the world's factory right there in the mainland China. The supply chain consequences and the technology connectivities have been put to question, and right now, and it puts one of the beneficiaries of China's uh, miscalculations or errors in handling or assisting the rest in the pandemic cases. Taiwan has become even a more uh, outstanding center of technology products, including the chips and the cards that are very much needed in the production of higher value added goods. The pandemic also showed how connected the rest of the world, the members of the rest of the world are. You cannot produce a vaccine and just invoke what do you call that, national vaccine nationalism, or that your country would buy all the supply, or the supplies would also only be limited. No less than the World Health Organization has stated that you cannot confine. If you confine that, you think you would be free, shielding yourself from the rest of the world, which do not have access to the vaccine, and that's impossible. We live in the same biosphere, we live in the same globalized world, and precisely that's how COVID spread all over the world, because of the exchanges and interdependence that we have. Just wrapping up no one raised the question, the Thucydides trap, and I think that's very important. Hazarding quite with, and I put my neck out here. The Thucydides trap, Professor Graham Allison studied 16 cases, and out of that, 12 cases, in his opinion, fall into this deterministic way by which when there's an old power and a new power rising, they would tend to have this confrontation, and rivalry puts them into a war with each other. If that would be the case, from the very sample of Professor Graham Allison, 4 out of 16, that's a 25% record, do not fall into that framework, or are excluded, or are somehow they manage to escape that deterministic formula of Thucydides trap. But we also recall, especially that concept, that Thucydides, when the Greek polities for city-states, it was valid in a large sense because that was the ancient time, and no one had real-time information and access to what's happening on the other parts of the globe. The colonies or the city-states that are very far from the center are at the behest and mercy of whatever changes occur in the center, but not necessarily so now. Technology is bridging the gap of real-time information. And with real-time information, you can ascertain, even if there's a lot of fraudulent news or fake news, you can still try and be able to distill the shock from the grain. So on some of these counts, I do not think that we should be resigned to a deterministic mode. We still have to be Grotian, if not Kantian, in trying to insist that there's a way out, but we have to continue the talking, but not just talking. We have to bear in mind the larger, the thread that connects us. Whatever you do in the region or in other parts of the world, you cannot escape our interconnectedness. And it's interconnectedness as we are all human beings. We have aspirations, but we cannot insist on the old ways that I survive at your own expense. I think that would be another point that I would go for in saying that the Thucydides trap is not as formidable and deterministic as some theories would like to put up. Thank you very much.
With this, we would like to thank our speakers, Rear Admiral Retired Rommel Ju Ong and Professor Jaime B. Naval, for joining us in today's discussion on regional conflict and security. Thank you as well to our audience. Thank you for staying with us, and we hope that you were able to gain new insights from this very good session. So also an important reminder for our participants who requested for an e-certificate of attendance, please refer to the Zoom access mail sent to you by SSP for instructions on how to get one for this panel. So join us again Monday next week for the final installment of the 5th Katipunan webinar series entitled Reading the Tea Leaves, Future Developments in the Region. Pre-registration for the session is currently ongoing until 6 p.m. on Sunday, October 25. On behalf of the organizers of the 5th Katipunan Conference, Thank you once again to our panelists and attendees for joining us today. This has been your moderator, Captain Diane Despi. Thank you very much, and please stay safe.
Thank you.